Hey look, this time it's a different fortress that gets besieged. Cheers. Welcome back to the 5th day of Mousemas, when we talk about Salamandastron, the, 5th book in publication order of the Redwall series by Brian Jacques, which is what we're doing until Epiphany, which is the 6th of January for all of you heathens out there. Anyway, let's talk about it and do the usual thing. I'll give you a quick rundown of what this book is about, and then we'll talk about what I think is good about this, or is bad about this, or is just interesting about it, and all of that. So, let's get started and talk about what Salamandastron is about. Alright, so Salamandastron does take place somewhere between the events of Marielle of Redwall and, the events of Redwall. So we are somewhere in that yet-to-be-defined era between those books. We'll find out that it also takes place after the book Martin the Warrior, which is sort of set also in that era. Anyway, we'll talk about that tomorrow. My point is, it is somewhere in those places. We have, obviously, I focus on the mountain fortress of Salamandastron, the firelizard mountain of the Badger Lords. But we also have stuff happening in Redwall Abbey, and we have some questing to do, because it's, it's Redwall, and questing is what will happen all the time. So let's look at what goes on in this book in some more detail. See, Salamandastron, the mountain fortress, is under attack by Farago the assassin, who is a, weasel, I think. Or am I? Yeah, he's a weasel with blue eyes. So there's that. And his horde is trying to besiege or take over Salamandastron, the mountain, under Badger Lord Earthstripe, who is the son of... he's one of those badgers. I confused the line completely every single time. So that is that part. Then there is Redwall Abbey, and there's, Redwall Abbey stuff happening, and at some point the sword of Martin the Warrior gets stolen, so it has to be retrieved. Also, Redwall Abbey is suffering from the plague. These are obviously medieval tales, so there is medieval stuff going on, and having a good old plague is part of that. So Dryditch fever catches the Abbey, and some people need to figure out what to do about that. So these are the main events, or the main sort of locations, being the Salamandastron and Redwall Abbey, having different problems. And the siege, as I already mentioned, is around Salamandastron this time around. We also have, obviously, the quest of Mara, the adoptive daughter of Earthstripe, the Lord of Salamandastron, who is, first captured by Farago and his son Klitch, and then flees with a hare companion and ends up with, finding friends and so forth, and, having a quest of her own. And that's roughly the stuff I want to talk about before we get into spoilers, because, you should read this one. It's another fun one. Maybe not as good or not as fulfilling to me or exciting to me as Marielle of Redwall, but it's still, it's still a really, really good book. So let's talk about what it does, where it goes, and what can be what I want to talk about for this one. So let's start with the first important element that I think is switching up the sort of siege to Salamandastron. I think was a good choice, because having Redwall Abbey be attacked by whatever horde of weasels and stoats every single book can get stale after a while. It has always been interesting because of, the different sort of nuance that happens around it every single time. But we are, having a different fort to be besieged with different tactics and so forth, I think makes it for, entertaining stuff, because besieging a mountain fortress is different than besieging an abbey. And we have people trying to dig tunnels again. We have people trying to do interesting new things of harm. And I think that's probably the most important new thing added to the Redwall world, is the introduction of poison and illness. Because while, on the one hand, Redwall Abbey is suffering from the Dryditch fever, Farago does actually send in his fox poisoner to poison the food in Salamandastron. So having having people die without, physical violence, I think, is a new one for Redwall, and certainly can be a pretty dark one. And in particular, the whole plot line around Redwall and the fever, I think, is quite dark for a children's book, because while, kids get sick all the time, having people die from sickness is something that hopefully most children are not necessarily usually confronted by. So having an entire story about that, and we have, Thrub and his little dormouse companion go and find the magic plant that helps and all of that, and having that quest, we always have those situations where people just die for no fault of their own. The same going on, obviously, with the two hares that are poisoned in Salamandastron, and of course, finally Klish also dying of it, which is, restorative justice, which we kind of like. It's certainly something that happens a lot in the Redwall books, because it's the kind of justice that a lot of children's books go for. It's like the bad guys get what they have coming, and usually it's in some sort of poetic way that fits what they have done before. So yeah, I think the addition of that form of death, I feel, is an interesting new approach. Another thing I wanted to mention is, of course, the way Redwall Abbey is invaded by two stoats this time around. Those being people that flee from Farrago's army, which is, once again, having a mad evil overlord is never healthy for anyone under his command, and we've obviously learned the same this time around, with Farrago killing people left and right all the time. But having, two people flee and try to do something else, they're not necessarily, they're not good guys, certainly. I mean, they kill people and they steal stuff, but they're less evil, ultimately evil. They're more like bumbling fools, and there's certainly something to be said about the idea of having slapstick comedy with your bad guys, and having, evil people also be less intelligent and so forth. I don't necessarily know where I fall on that one. It is a staple. It is a staple of children's entertainment everywhere, having the stupid henchmen run into walls, do dumb shit all the time. And there is certainly an element of, I guess, ableism, you might call it, where you sort of equate evil and lack of intelligence. And the thing is, I don't want to drag this one too far, because you can do that, and if this were books written for adults, I think it would be absolutely unforgivable. With children's books, I don't necessarily know if I'm going down the same road, because on the one hand, it kind of depends on how you spin that, right? It kind of depends on whether you go these people are stupid, so that's why they turn to evil, or these people are evil and that's why they're stupid. And that's sort of kind of where this goes. Having evil be very much self-defeating because of all these elements of what describes evil in the Redwall world, is certainly one part, right? You have people constantly backstabbing each other and so forth, even when it feels incredibly unreasonable to do that, right? So that is one way, and obviously it's always funny to have evil hench rats, mostly, or hench stoats or whatever, trip over their own weapons and so forth. It's funny, it's sort of can be a form of comic relief. It's certainly a tradition in a lot of children's entertainment, and has always been, whether it's your Disney cartoons or anything else. I just feel that it might be sort of... There's certainly a darker side to this. As I said, these are children's books, so I'm careful to not call it out too much, but I think it's something to keep in mind, how that often happens, and how you have a lot of these characters act like that. Now, obviously, with Ding-Eye and his companion here, something more is going on there. They're very much sort of your generally greedy, not thinking far ahead kind of people, and they end up in Redwall, and they're clearly enjoying themselves, but because they have no self-control, no discipline in any way, shape, or form, they end up accidentally killing the archivist, and then they just run and leave. They may also have been the people bringing the dry ditch fever into the abbey. That's never fully explored, and I'm kind of glad it is not fully explored, because there's a lot of ways this could have gone horribly wrong. Maybe the fever just happened to be there because might just happen, right? And luckily those are stoats and not rats, because then stuff would have been much more troubling in a lot of ways. But yeah, I find it interesting to have this sort of plot line with two two bad characters that are bad but not fundamentally evil sort of enter Redwall and almost manage to, become sort of acceptable until they accidentally kill someone and run away. And obviously that's me giving like the most benefit of the doubt to them, to those characters, and also to Brian Jacques in that regard. So there's other ways of reading this. I'm aware of that. I just found it interesting to point that out because it gives us some more nuance to the larger sort of way that the bad guys, the villains, are portrayed in these books. They're not, in this case, not power hungry, mad. They're just like greedy and so forth. And we'll have to talk about the idea of lack of control and greed as one part of evil, because there's a long tradition to that can lead into all kinds of really, really bad sort of like directions. It hasn't so far with Redwall. I just wanted to bring it up. If we come back to it in like a later book, and I can then go like, well, I've mentioned it before. The other interesting part is, of course, the dynamic between Farago and his son. Having a power-hungry, mad main villain and some of their captains trying to supplant them is certainly something that has happened in every single of these books. Technically, in Mossflower, we have Zamina murder her father to take over the courtier, the fortress. That has certainly happened there, but it happens at the beginning, so we don't actually see that kind of form of conflict. So it's interesting to see it this time round actually play out in front of our eyes in this specific way, and having that ongoing sort of conflict where father and son are well aware of the fact that the son wants to take over the band from his father, and the father's kind of aware of that, and they're having this sort of like almost open sort of competition of backstabbing, which is a new dynamic compared to what we saw in previous books, where either there was, just people trying to murder their boss for all kinds of reasons, or in Marielle, we had Grey Patch just going like, well, fuck this, I'm out of here, I'll do my own thing. So Brian Jacques is experimenting with, once again, things that have happened before, or sort of parts of the construction of these stories, and giving them a new and interesting twist. And what I find interesting there is you can compare, there's a lot of parallels going on in this, and we'll come back to that in a moment. You can parallel the sort of dynamic between Farago and his son to the dynamic between Earthstripe and his adoptive daughter, Mara. Because there's obviously a conflict between parents and children and their children going on in this book. And this kind of makes sense, because if children always have conflicts with their parents. It's just like something that happens as part of growing up. The question is usually how you deal with those kind of things. And obviously with the bad guys, it's constantly about overthrowing them, whereas and taking over and being like them, only more so. Whereas on the other side with Mara and Earthstripe, we have the idea of Mara trying to make it on her own and sort of get out of her father's control, which then is very interesting. And I want to point this part out because I found it very fascinating for a children's book, because we get Earthstripe's perspective on this, and I really appreciated the way Brian Jacques goes about this, right? Because we have Earthstripe going like, well, she's clearly doing something she's not supposed to. She's doing a lot of bad things, but I can't actually go and be too harsh on her, because that would actually make things worse. And having a children's book where the parents are actually going through the different options of discipline and how to sort of discipline their children or educate their children, and trying to figure out how to do that in a way that is actually not harmful, and no physical discipline or anything of the sort, not even locking her up or anything, not yelling at her too much most of the time, trying to give her freedom and hoping that she will actually get it on her own. I think that's a really interesting approach for a story that is in so many ways, it's medieval fantasy with fluffy animals. It could be incredibly conservative in a lot of ways, and you have to do what your parents tell you, because otherwise bad shit happens. It's like, yes, bad shit happens to Mara, but she never gets really reproved for doing that. She figures out on her own that some of the things her father said would have been good to listen to. On the other hand, also, and that's something we have seen before, right? Redwall is very much the series is very much about people trying to find their place, and if their place is not in the society they were born into, then it's totally fine for them to find a different place and go somewhere else, which is why Dandan and Marielle left Redwall at the end of Marielle of Redwall, because they're not made to be well, order mice in monks and nuns' habits and living in the abbey. They want to go out and have adventures. It's why Matthias could not join the order as well, because he was made to be a warrior. And it's why Mara, at the end, does not go back to Salamandastron, because that's not her place. And she doesn't like the very military discipline of that specific place. And instead, she decides to go to Redwall and become defender of Redwall, which is, apparently being the resident badger is both... is actually a sort of like post and at the abbey at this point, which is interesting. But that's sort of like her decision. I think that's something Brian Jacques does really well, and that I personally appreciate in these specific books as literature for children, because it can be really, really powerful for a kid to read a book when you grow up and you feel like you're not actually fully belonging, and the kind of experience, the things that people expect of you are something you don't actually feel like fulfilling and so forth, and trying to and having books that tell you, well, you know what, if you don't fit in, just be yourself, and there will be a place for you as well if you are who you are, and there will be a place where you fit in, and you just need to find that specific place. And it's totally fine if that's not the place your parents have seen for you. That's a pretty fucking powerful message to any kid, right? And I feel this book does that again. And as I said, like the way that Earthstripe, being the good guy, obviously, and Badger Lord, does actually understand how to deal with rebellious children. That's pretty fucking good for like children's books in the early 90s, right? Just saying. I really appreciated that. So those are like two parallels that we see in this book. And then there's another one that I found interesting, because it's another parallel storyline in a way, and that is, of course, Samkin the squirrel and Marula the mole trying to find or get back Martin's sword, which was stolen by the Stoats, right? And Mara meeting the Guzim and having to bring back the black stone of the Guzim, which has also been taken, accidentally stolen or whatever by, obviously, Nostripe, the brother of Earthstripe, right? Is his name Nostripe? You know what I mean, like the albino badger, obviously. So we have another sort of like plot line where we have like two plot lines that do the same thing in different places, and then all of these different parallels kind of converge, and that's a very powerful storytelling tool, right? Having sort of these storylines mirror each other, it's something that makes the whole thing feel more coherent, even though compared to, say, the last one, Marielle, this one is a bit more over the place when it comes to where creatures are running to and having all of that stuff happening, right? So it is more messy in that regard, but by having these different parallels, it does feel different in that regard, right? It does feel more accessible, because you kind of see those reflections and parallels in there. So that's something really, really nice, I thought, and I wanted to mention that specific part. There's obviously more to be talked about, so let's look at some of the other elements that I found really interesting in this one. And let's look at the Guzim some more. And I found them, personally, I'm really a huge fan of, Guerrilla Union Shrews. That's just like really cool. And something that I haven't necessarily mentioned before, but the whole idea of the black stone, I found it just like really funny, because the Guzim there's certainly some form of a more alternative organized society, right? The guy who holds the rock, the black stone, is the person who's allowed to speak. Now, if you've ever been into any leftist circles, any sort of like, not anarchist, but like self-organizing leftist alternative-like circles, there is a practice of having sort of some sort of sign that allows the holder of that sign to speak, and then you hand it off to the next person to, make, talking, having conversations and so forth in councils and so forth easier. So having the Guzim use the same sort of method just makes it really, really interesting and fun, because there's, a lot of jokes about that specific practice, because it can feel kind of silly and so forth. But with the Guzim, it does also work. And in this storyline, we learn from Lugalog, this Lugalog, the boss of the Guzim, or like the leader of the Guzim, we learn that while that sort of like structure they have in place to organize their society, the Black Stone, while that is stolen, the only way for him to control or lead in some way or form, obviously they usually have votes anyway, but like people only follow him because he rules them by violence. And now, this is obviously a children's book and not, a handbook on political theory, but the idea that you can either have like democratic processes, whatever shape they take, or you have rule by sheer force. Now that's a very fundamental understanding of politics right there, and that the Guzim decide that that's actually not what they want to do. So they want to sort of reestablish a democratic order. Now that's, I found that really interesting as an aside for just like one group of animals that are, well, they're shrews and they're sort of like river pirates and they're always fighting and they're always doing their own thing. But they also have these sort of like very, very fundamental ideas and concepts of how to run a society that is just like pushed in there on the side of like a children's book about, rats besieging a badger mountain, well, weasels and rats and foxes besieging a mountain held by badgers, right? So that's just like really interesting what you can get away with or what you can do with children's literature by doing these kind of things. There's a set in this book, there's a quote at some point where people say like, there's no difference of class or species in Redwall. And yeah, you know what? That's a pretty powerful statement right there. I said it's not exactly an anarchist utopia, but it gets pretty fucking close for a children's book from, written by a guy born in the 1930s, actually. So that's just something I find really interesting, that Redwall does sort of portray different ways of running a society, right? You have Salamandastron, which is a very military, hierarchical society with the Badger Lord running the place, and you have the long patrol of hares serving him, and, there's, it's a very Spartan kind of way of running shit, and then you have Redwall Abbey, which is very much the opposite, and depending on what you as a character like, what you as an animal prefer, that's sort of like the society you kind of choose to live in, and that's, pretty fucking cool, is what I would say. Unfortunately, we once again have a cannibal plot line or plot element and plot point, and we've met the toads in that swamp before in previous books. Well, actually, in the previous book in Marielle of Redwall, because apparently the swamp kind of lies somewhere between Redwall and Salamandastron. That's something we've learned by now. And not much to add here. Having like a tribe of toads that live in the swamp and capture other people and eat them, or eat themselves, like some of their own kind, if they don't find other creatures to eat, and are somewhat are very much sort of like primitive coded in a lot of ways, is troubling. It's bad. Once again, I think it's partly something that just was done until fairly recently. It took a long time for authors from, say, America or the UK or parts of Western Europe in a lot of ways to realize that shit's racist, and you probably shouldn't just like keep perpetuating these specific sort of tropes and elements. And this is just too old to have that in there. So it's important to be aware of that specific fact. And while it is certainly that specific trope, at least it's animals and not humans. It would be, there's enough children's books or like sort of adventure stories for younger young adults or whatever, early teens and so forth, where the whole same like cannibal plotline happens and it's people, right? It's humans, and that's far more racist than this. So I guess you can get away with it. The whole like essentialism is still sort of a problem where technically any animal can get into Redwall. We certainly have seen carnivores of all kinds hang out in Redwall. Badgers certainly eat meat. Otters certainly eat meat when they get it. We have the whole like Scottish Highland eagles and falcons hang out there, and we had the kite in the last book. So we do have birds that are very much raptors, be welcome and live in Redwall Abbey. They're all apparently very much also vegetarians when they can get all the wonderful Redwall food. But it is certainly something that we see there. But we still haven't seen like weasels or stoats or foxes be good guys. They're beggars, they're poisoners, they're slavers, they have all of these, that's the foxes in particular, they have all of these anti-Sigonist sort of elements in there. Once again, it's something that could be ignored in a lot of ways, except for that first Redwall novel where Chickenhound and his mother are actually called the G word, the G slur in the text. So that specific connection is made much more explicit than the whole cannibal one is in this book and was in the Matty Mayo with the squirrels or whatever they were, the painted ones. So this is, yeah, it's just in there. Now, I would be very happy if we would see some foxes or weasels or stoats actually be, actually end up in Redwall and join with Redwall. I don't think we get that. Having Ding-Eye and his idiot friend be, or idiot is probably too strong a word, but his also very very careless friend hang out in Redwall for a while and enjoy themselves there while not actually submitting to any form of Abbey discipline at all, is probably the best we're going to get in that regard, which is certainly a missed opportunity, but maybe that's once again just too much to expect from books written in the 80s and early 90s, where that kind of thinking was not yet fully in there. And we do see Brian Jacques go beyond just very clear black and white when it comes to a lot of aspects, but I don't think the species essentialism is something that he can fully get rid of in these books, which is obviously a missed opportunity. Maybe the later ones will go there. I haven't read anything beyond these first 5 so far, so who knows? Maybe I'll find something there. But certainly something I'm still troubled by, I guess. So let's talk about one or two final things. And we need to talk more about the food. Now, the food is once again a massive thing here, and obviously everyone is eating all the time. We get more details about the preparation of food. And I think there's something interesting here, and we will talk more about that later when we come back to the Britishness of it all in probably a different video. But the whole long, detailed description of preparations of food, of banquets and so forth is on the one hand something that feels very medieval, something that, George R. R. Martin does in his Game of Thrones, in its Song of Ice and Fire and so forth. But the over much detail, I feel, adds to Redwall and gives it a very unique sort of element in children's literature of the time. The fact that everyone is constantly actually completely gorging themselves and eating way too much, I think works really well for children's books because children like to eat sweet stuff and so forth. The fact that everyone is constantly drinking ale and cider, also very British, I guess. It's just is interesting in how Brian Jacques kind of used that in the first novel and has turned the preparation of food more and more into a trademark element of the series, something that will come up early on, that will come up again and again, and we see that happening, being a key thing that makes Redwall feel like Redwall, and having specific elements that make your story feel, or your world feel unique, is very difficult to achieve, and Jacques has found a few things that are doing that. And it's not that there's furry animals, murdering each other brutally. It's actually, having silly songs that are sort of, in that regard, fascinating. It's having, all these groups that have acronyms. It's having poems that explain the future. It's having, all that food. It adds to that very specific Redwall atmosphere, and I think it's just impressive to see how Jacques managed to build that out from the first novel that he wrote. That's one thing. Another thing that I found interesting is the name day ritual. Something we haven't, it was mentioned before, but we see more and more of folklore develop through these stories, right? So we have the ritual of a name day, that the abbot or abbess of Redwall Abbey gives the season a name, and we had obviously the name of the season of the late blooming rose is the first one mentioned in Redwall, and you can see after a while this becomes a thing. So this time around it's figuring out what the name will be for the season, and then they have the name day feast and everything, and we had that whole ritual described with the otter disguising himself as a ghost and having a guardian of the season of the food, and you have to give the name of the new season, and then the guardian will give up the food. That feels very reminiscent of folk practices that we have over in all kinds of Europe all the time. So it's just cute and still meaningful element in here that I found really interesting. Goes back to the fact that Brian Jacques clearly knows what he's doing when he writes about these sort of medieval practices and so forth. So that's one part that I wanted to mention, and one or two minor bits and pieces that I still found interesting. The fact that the whole quest for the flowers is an almost non-violent quest. I mean, yes, there is the fight with the crows, and then they find the falcon and carrying with them, but it's a fairly non-violent plot line, which is interesting compared to some of the other quests that we've seen so far, where a lot of violence happens. So that's certainly something I found interesting. We'll see if there's more of those kind of adventures that are not necessarily solved by violence, but more by helping others. Will continue. I assume so. And we need to talk about the weed and the mysticism of the badgers, because we learn more about the whole, like, badgers knowing about the future and carving history into the mountain, into that chamber, which is really cool. We've seen that show for the first time in with Boar the Fighter in Mountain of Salamandastron in Mossflower, and this time around with Earthstripe we see him actually do the thing, right? Which is he lights some herbs which give a earthy aroma of the forest and so forth, which is interesting, right? We don't know what kind of herbs those are, but we can certainly make guesses if we're cynical. And then in that trance, he actually carves the future into the mountain, and then he steps back and awakes from his trance, and he can read the future out of that. That's just like a really cool form of like prediction, of divination, magic or non-magic, depending on how you want to read that. That I just like found really, really well done. It's like, that's a really cool thing. I want to use that for my next tabletop role-playing game somewhere. I just can hope that my players don't watch these videos, which... hopefully. Anyway, so just wanted to bring that up as something I've really appreciated, because it does once again feel very folk magic-y in a way that adds to that medieval feel that Redwall has. And that's all I have for Salamandastron. Nice book. I had fun. I learned a lot more. The next one will be Martin the Warrior, which is apparently the frame narrative is set after Marielle, and the story is about Martin, so it's probably set before even Mossflower. We'll find out tomorrow. Until then, well, thanks for watching. Cheers, and once again, Eulalia.